Hello, my name is Alan Lee. I'm a student of Mark Knoyer's here at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm going to be talking today about an overview of iron technology in Northwestern South Asia during the Proto-historic and early historic periods. It's a long time frame, it's about 2,000 years, and the story of iron technology is a complicated one and it deserves a lot of attention. And we're going to be talking about it today through its multiple different avenues that current research is delving into. And before we go any further, I need to extend some thank yous. First, a thank you to my advisor, Dr. Mark Knoyer. It is simply a pleasure and a privilege to be his student. And he has done a tremendous amount for me over the years, and this research simply wouldn't be possible without him. I would also like to extend a warm thank you to Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Anhayan for putting together this conference and inviting me to be a part of it. It's simply wonderful to be able to get together with other scholars of South Asia and talk about history and technology. There are many people else on this list that I simply don't have enough time to thank, but if you're up here, your institution's up here, please take my warm thank you for allowing me to be able to do this research. To begin, there are four major avenues of research on iron technology that are currently prevalent in South Asian archaeology about northwestern South Asia in particular during this time period. And broadly speaking, these four avenues can be lumped under two umbrellas. There is the origins and beginnings of the iron technology in northwestern South Asia. That's basically its own topic, its own umbrella. And then there's the lived experience of iron technology during this time period, which is a second umbrella. That's the three other avenues: the production and industry, the fabrication traditions, and the social practices surrounding iron technology. Now, in my opinion, much of the research has been about the first of these two umbrellas, the origins and beginnings of iron technology. So we're going to begin our discussion there and talk about the models that have been very dominant in the discussion over this craft in its earliest stages, which is right around the time of the mid second millennium BCE. When talking about the origins and beginnings of iron technology in northwestern South Asia during the early historic and proto-historic period, there have been two primary models that have been used to describe the earliest advent of this technology. There's the immigration diffusion model, which has proposed that iron technology during the second millennium BCE was brought into northwestern South Asia from either the Achaemenids in 600 BCE or Indo-Aryan speaking peoples around the turn of the second millennium BCE. That has been the earlier model that was put forward. It's been challenged quite frequently after the 1970s by the indigenous development model that has been primarily using sources from, especially from the Gangetic region, that have had dates being pushed further and further back into the second millennium BCE. Now, both these models, I'm going to contend, they have pros and cons to both of them. And specifically, the immigration diffusion model has been critiqued quite heavily, and the indigenous development model has been more supported in modern academic literature. But I want to talk about them both separately and describe the issues that may be present in both of them. So first, let's discuss the immigration diffusion model. So the immigration diffusion model, as I said before, talks about the introduction of iron technology coming in from the west, either by the Achaemenids in 600 BCE or Indo-Aryan speaking peoples about the second millennium BCE. The trouble with this model is that it did not hold up well over time. Specifically, the Achaemenids, that was a model put forward by, I believe, Wheeler in the early 1950s to describe what he was seeing at Balahazar in Charsada. He was describing that he was finding iron remains in the levels around 600 BC, the first iron. The problem is that that's not very reflective of the archaeological record. When we look at sites across northwestern South Asia, which I've included in the map, there are several sites at which iron technology appears well before the Achaemenid influence was a factor in this part of the world. At Mundigak, there are iron buttons on different objects as well as an iron bell inside of an iron ringer inside of a bell. There is slags from smithing at Charsada around 1200 BCE, and at Udigram there has been recent discovery of iron hairpins in some of the proto-historic graves. Now, if we were not looking even further beyond northwest South Asia into the Gangetic region, there is also evidence of furnaces and ironworking well before 1600 BCE, or at least that has been what has been reported by modern scholars. This pretty thoroughly contradicts the idea that iron technology was brought in, especially from the Achaemenids. Now, for the Indo-Aryan speaking peoples, that's a much trickier claim. It's much more tricky to dispute because there's not, to my understanding, much evidence for Indo-Aryan speaking peoples causing or bringing in a tremendous amount of knowledge into this part of the world. I could be wrong on that, but specifically for iron technology, I have not seen any conclusive evidence to suggest that they are the ones who brought in this technology. Now, that said, does that leave us with only the indigenous model as a substitute? There are, I think, some difficulties with the indigenous model. Primarily, there are a few assumptions that are being made and have been made that complicate the issue. For one, it does make sense that there are iron resources in South Asia. However, there is an assumption that because there was ore present in the past, and that there are modern indigenous smelters, they are the Agaria peoples, that were present smelting up to at least the 1940s, there's the assumption that because there's ore, therefore the model must be an indigenous creation. The iron technology must have come from indigenous peoples learning and promoting the craft. That's an assumption I'm going to address in a bit. There's also the issue of using the Agaria as the reference point, because it's not necessarily the case that their more recent traditional craft is reflective of the early historic period of the proto-historic period. And there's also the problems of there are just differences between the regions in South Asia. A lot of the work that's been talking about the indigenous model specifically deals with the Gangetic region. That may not be applicable necessarily to our part of northwestern South Asia. And I'd like to push, this comes back to the first assumption, that if ore is present, should we expect that learning about iron technology is an indigenous process? That assumption doesn't hold up. Because when we look at the uniqueness of iron technology, we know that iron is the most abundant transition metal in Earth's crust. And it's because of that factor, combined with the fact that iron is a robust metal that has many useful and valuable properties. I mean, we've actually studied this metal more than every other metal almost combined, that this metal is particularly useful. It's so useful that we harvest it today on Earth, 1.5 billion metric tons of it every year approximately. That is a Lake Mendota. This is the lake outside of my university. That's a Lake Mendota's worth of iron every year. And just for size reference, this circle is the Capitol building in our city. It's an enormous amount of iron. So the assumption that if there's ore present, that indigenous people must have been the ones responsible for the creation of technology, I don't think really holds up. Because if that assumption was true, why isn't iron technology universally present across the ancient world? We know that it wasn't. In North America and Central America, South America, Australia, there is a tremendous amount of iron ore present that could have been used that simply was not used in the past. Because, as far as I'm aware, it was not socially relevant at the time. There's that assumption that because there's ore present that it must have been used, I'm not sure holds up. And when I compare, more importantly, how extensive
in the
iron is
form of
across
cells.
Northwest South Asia, I've run into some problems. So I took mineral data from the United States Geological Survey, and I just wanted to see how extensive are the ore resources to begin with in northwestern South Asia. I'm coming up with some odd results. The iron deposits, according to the United States Geological Survey, seem rather sparse in this part of the world. And I'm not sure if that's simply because it's not being reported or if there's something else going on, if there's some social or political aspect preventing the acquisition of data. Now, that said, when we look at later time periods in this part of the world, specifically in Central Asia, we know there is a booming iron industry, at least for crucible steel technology. So we might expect that there should be sources, perhaps extensive and abundant iron resources in northwestern South Asia that are either not reported or haven't been mapped to the fullest degree. So we're in a strange space with the indigenous model. On one hand, there are modern indigenous smelters who have practiced an ancient craft. On the other hand, I'm not sure if there's a causal link connecting their craft, which is primarily in central South Asia. I'm not sure there is a link from them to northwestern South Asia. And more importantly, I'm not sure at the moment if there is even the resource, the abundant iron technology that would even support the central assumption of the indigenous model. So, from there, where could we move from when talking about the origins of iron technology? Perhaps we should move to a mixed model, where we take ideas from both the indigenous model and from the immigration/diffusion model and see if there could be a way to say, well, maybe it's a bit of both. When we look at the environmental conditions of northwestern South Asia and using elevation, slope gradients, and temperature, the average vegetation index, and the rainfall of this region, we can try and classify areas into habitation zones. And I did that using a couple of set conditions. And a habitation zone, as far as I'm concerned, is just an area where we might expect to see more human activity relative to other areas. This is not some sort of environmentally deterministic map. It's simply suggestive of what we might see or might expect to see about human activity using only environmental data and only a limited amount of environmental data. To do this, I selected rainfall above 30 millimeters per year on average for the primary lands, an NVDI of above 0.3, that means very green. Average temperatures around 75 degrees, plus or minus some, and a slope less than 10. And I just simply made the conditions a little more harsh for the secondary. I would like to state again, though, that just because I don't have a pixel colored blue or green doesn't mean that people were not living there. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is when I use this environmental data and then plot my archaeological sites on top of it, they're not comprehensive, but it's quite a few iron-bearing archaeological sites on this map. It's about 30 so far, and some of them are quite major, like Perak, Charsada, Taxila, so on and so forth. I plot them on the map along with a known major trade route, the Uttarapata. It cuts through this region of perhaps environmentally positive areas for human activity. What this would suggest to me is that we should expect that people and information are moving into and out of Northwest South Asia simply because of the environment, but also because this seems to be reflective in the record itself, just where the sites and the trade routes are. So, combining this data with the historical record, that during the early historic period, we know that multiple groups of people were entering northwestern South Asia, from the Achaemenids all the way to the Kushan, we should expect suspect that perhaps the origins and development of iron technology was not simply an either or statement. Perhaps there's a relationship where you have indigenous local blacksmiths or indigenous local people talking to people coming from outside the region, learning technology or learning how to adapt technology to their environment. And this could be coming from either direction. It doesn't need to be coming from the west. It could be people from the Gangetic region coming up into Northwest South Asia, carrying technology from east to west. That's possible. Or it could be simple indigenous 100%. We had more information needs to be gathered to answer this question in totality. Specifically, where are the sources? How abundant are they? And do we have any connection between the two regions, between the three regions, I should say? Beyond the origins and beginnings, there is another major topic about iron technology in northwestern South Asia that needs to be talked about, and that is the lived experience of iron technology. In my opinion, more needs to be done on this, because all of these things would be how ancient people would experience this technology as they lived it. There would be a production and an industry surrounding them. There would be practices, social practices, and consumption of this iron material. How do you do it properly? What's the place of a blacksmith in the village? Who gets iron? When do you get to use it? Do you get the same quality? And that is connected to the fabrication traditions of blacksmiths. You can't have any one of these factors, this lived experience of iron, without the other two. And this gives us a very comprehensive understanding of iron technology, but we're still, in my opinion, learning more and more about this part of the story. One of the things that has been a prominent feature of this is trying to understand, was iron utilitarian or ornamental in its earliest stages in northwestern South Asia? So, from my understanding and my analysis, I have seen so far a pattern. Pre-800 BCE, in the Proto-historic grave assemblages and at the site of Mundigak in Afghanistan, there seems to be a predominance of ornaments and weapons in mortuary contexts. In specific, I would like to draw attention to the hairpins at Udigram, where you have iron hairpins that seem to be mimicking copper hairpins from an earlier time frame. This is interesting. We know in other parts of the world, such as Egypt, that the earliest form of iron technology comes in beads, ornamental beads from meteoritic iron. It's interesting to suggest that perhaps at the earliest time period of iron technology's growth in northwestern South Asia, it was primarily used as an ornamental or a symbolic metal, and particularly in these mortuary contexts. Now, that said, what we see is skewed. Specifically, if we're looking at the mortuary records of proto-historic northwest South Asia, the abundance of graves being the primary source of information gives us one look at life in this part of the world at this time period, not a comprehensive one. So we could be skewed in this regard. But after 800 BCE, there does seem to be a change. The earliest forms of iron seem to shift, and the variety of iron objects increases, and some common iron objects still continue to dominate. Iron arrowheads, spear points, still are the predominant form of iron technology, but specifically in cities like in Sirkap and Taxila and Atranjikera, we see an increase in the sheer number of different kinds of iron artifacts. This is interesting because it suggests that there is now an iron industry that is growing and expanding that might go beyond what might have been simple sort of elite status goods into a more utilitarian aspect of life. But what I'm talking about with an iron industry is just a system of production that operates within an understandable pattern, and that an industry could be controlled from the top down by elites or from the bottom up by traditions and learned experiences. And to understand, to continue to understand the story of iron technology, we have to kind of understand how is iron being produced? What is the industry, quote, as it would look like? And I want to give an example of what understanding an industry can look like using a later example. I would really recommend that if you're interested in iron, understanding historic iron industries, look at Bryce Gerbel's dissertation. It came out a few years ago about the technological concept of crucible steel production in northern Telangana. Through systematic and extensive survey, he was able to identify two overlapping and separate groups of iron producers in a very close by area. This would imply that there's overlapping traditions and complexity occurring around the iron industry during the historic period, which is, I believe, around the 17th century CE. This is what we could hope to expect one day to understand more about the early historic and proto-historic iron technologies. But what we know right now is that what we have not seen in Northwestern South Asia is we have not seen any sort of massive scale industry yet. A good example of what that could look like is this is the site of Paplonia and on the coast of Italy, and the island of Elba off the coast. This was a site that was used by the early Roman Republic and later Empire to mass produce iron and steel, to such a degree that a stretch of the beach was unwalkable because there was so much slag deposited on the surface. That is something that we do not currently see in Northwest South Asia. Rather, what we see is a much smaller scale industry. We've primarily only seen evidence of forging in proto and early historic periods in Northwest South Asia. At sites like Sirkup, we found anvils and iron billets. There's smithing slag from Charsada about 1200 BCE, a forge from Ujjain, and another forge from Atranjikara. Again, bigger city sites, not village settlements, as far as I am aware right now. Now, this might seem strange. Should we expect to find more evidence for an iron industry during the Proto and early historic time periods? I would argue yes, based on early historical resources. So, at the very least, there are several different resources, many of them from outside of South Asia, that talk about iron technology coming from South Asia. Now, this does not necessarily mean Northwestern South Asia, but perhaps we could draw some conclusions. Perhaps we could draw some evidence from these speakers, specifically Herodotus, who at 450 BCE described Indian archers in the Persian army. So these archers probably came from Northwest South Asia, as the Achaemenid Empire had claimed some dominance over the region. We could also expect that perhaps when Pliny the Elder was talking about steel from Sarus and Parthia, that perhaps one of those two regions was also including Northwest South Asia. And we could use the record from Quintus Curtius Rufus, who described that Alexander the Great, during his conquests into Northwestern South Asia, was presented ferrum candidum, or bright iron. This might have been steel, but certainly from groups within Northwestern South Asia. Also, Catulia, the legendary teacher of Chandragupta Maurya, was a teacher, supposedly, at Taxila, the great university there, and was responsible for, or at least accredited, writing the majority of the Arthasastra, the great book of the great state book of the Mauryan Empire. Within this, he references iron technology multiple times. So there is getting into the social practices of iron technology during the early historic and proto-historic periods, we're presented with a strange mix. Perhaps during the early historic period, maybe there was some evidence for a centralized practice of iron technology. Catulia does say multiple times that iron technology has a certain kind of value. Ironsmiths are supposed to live in the part of the city where artisans who work on precious stones and Brahmins reside. When a father dies, his youngest son, is supposed to inherit his iron and objects, his domestic utensils. Also, iron is supposed to be taxed. There is a fee for producing an object of iron, and there is a head of mines in charge of all of the metal mines, which would presumably include iron technology. These statements suggest that at least during the Mauryan state, there may have, which does include Northwestern South Asia, that perhaps there was in the late or the in the that perhaps in the early historic period there was a centralization of iron technology. However, when we go back to the resource maps, it raises the question, if iron technology is so spread across South Asia, is it easy to control? If there are no, quote, or very few major iron ore deposits, how does a state easily control this technology? Using the Agari as an example, this is where the modern ethnographic example is extremely useful, because controlling iron technology may not be that easy in South Asia. If the iron technology is dispersed over a large area, perhaps indigenous people will have easier access to it, and controlling that resource is more difficult. This is the complicated story of the social practices involved with iron technology during the early historic period. And this would go back into the proto-historic period perhaps as well. Is there another mixed model that could come out of this, where there's some sort of interplay between elites trying to control iron technology during this time period, as well as subversion of those elites, where people are able to access this material and produce iron technology in different ways for different groups? So moving forward, we need to better understand the lived experience around iron technology during the proto-historic and early historic periods. We need to establish some comparative data sets. We need to learn, where are these iron resources? What is the relative abundance? Could they be easily controlled? Are there other avenues of control? What kinds of iron objects occur at which sites? Do different people have different access to iron technology, and do they use it in different ways? Also, what are the differences between iron objects at the same site and between different sites? Do blacksmiths provide different qualities of material to different people? There are many different groups of individuals in Northwestern South Asia. There are perhaps common folk, perhaps religious associated folk, there are elites, there are many different groups to satisfy. Do they do it in the same way? Well, this is a part where I am trying to investigate more deeply, using Stupa Complexes as an avenue into this sort of lived experience around iron technology. So this is the Stupa of Bamala in South Asia. And iron technology is not abundant in the same way as it would be at a site like Taxila or Atranjiquera, because here iron technology seems to form a very specific role around construction. The majority of iron objects are about construction, specifically putting stucco figures into walls, or using iron nails and clamps to support supporting metal beams. I put in 2 figures of in situ stucco figures. Apparently, I believe that their iron clamps are on the backs. I'm still having trouble figuring out exactly how they stuck these incredibly heavy figures onto the walls, because it's not easily seen from the front. Same could be said for the supporting structures and the beams. But using what we found at Bamala as a case study example, I was trying to see, is there a difference between, let's say, something simple, the nails and the ties. The ties are these flat bars, and the nails go into the ties, like in the middle figure. and secure the ties to a wooden post or secure a stucco figure to a wall. And using some material analysis, I'm not going to get into this because it's a whole talk in and of itself. Preliminarily, I've seen that there does seem to be differences at the microscopic level that would make construction materials better suited for different tasks, which would imply that blacksmiths, at least the ones working in conjunction with the Stupa Complexes, were putting together materials with specific techniques in order to meet the demands of what the monks perhaps needed at those stupas. This is to hopefully give a deeper understanding of what it would have been like to be a blacksmith during the time of the early historic period. In conclusion, this has been a long talk, and it's covered a lot of ground because the story of iron technology in Northwestern South Asia is a tremendous one. It's almost too much to talk about in a short presentation. But if I was to say conclusion-wise, from my perspective, when we're talking about the different avenues of research, we should look at the origins and beginnings of iron technology. We should look at those beginnings perhaps as a mixed model. The earliest forms of technology, that seems to be primarily an ornamental technology that transitioned into the utilitarian one, with differences appearing at the different kinds of sites across the region. Also, the early iron industry perhaps should be a mixed model. Perhaps it was centrally controlled, perhaps it was not. Perhaps elites played a more or less of a role over iron technology during the proto-historic and early historic periods. This is something that needs to be examined more closely alongside blacksmithing traditions. With that said, thank you so much for your time. I hope it's been a good talk. I hope you've enjoyed it.